Good afternoon, Excellencies, dear colleagues. Welcome to this event on the impact of COVID-19 on aid, financing and equitable recovery, which is happening on the sidelines of the FFD Forum. We at the United Nations Foundation are delighted to co-host this discussion with our partners, Development Initiatives and Oxfam, to whom I'll turn the floor shortly. Excellencies and colleagues, just a few words from me before handing the floor over. The international community is facing the deepest global recession since the Second World War and the broadest collapse in the income since 1870. Approximately 120 million people have fallen back into extreme poverty, with 2.7 billion people living below or just above the poverty line, and the equivalent of 255 million jobs have been lost. Inequalities are growing exponentially, and developing countries face a financing gap of at least $2.5 trillion per year to achieve the SDGs outside of the impact of the COVID-19. Yesterday, Secretary General Guterres acknowledged that just 10 countries account for over 75% of vaccinations. We are seeing a global vaccine gap that threatens all our collective health and well-being, and it has been estimated that the unequal access and vaccine hoarding will cost more than $9 trillion. In addition to the 4.4% drop in global GDP due to the pandemic, foreign direct investment and remittances are estimated to drop in 2020 by 40% and 20% respectively. While many countries have implemented extraordinary fiscal and monetary policy measures to address the crises, developing countries face the dual challenge of financing the response to the pandemic and avoiding a major debt crisis that could set back SDG progress for years. Economically, developing countries have been and will continue to be hit the hardest. While the crisis threatens to erase hard-earned progress, these countries will require support and solidarity to recover. As an example, my own country, Timor-Leste, is struggling with the multiple challenges that are facing us right now. A huge outbreak of community transmission of COVID, unprecedented flood in the 40-year history of the country, and a government really struggling with the challenges of rolling out the vaccine, not sufficient access to vaccines as well, 24,000 doses for a population of 1.5 million, a country that has seen and hosted UN peacekeeping missions for over a decade, seeing development gains that were investments made by the international community washed away and wiped out in the span of a year. And this has to be a conversation that leads to solutions for countries like Timor-Leste. Because as the Secretary General said yesterday, we need to heed to the lessons now if we are to reverse these dangerous trends, prevent successive waves of infection, avoid a lengthy global recession, and get back on track to fulfill the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Climate Agreement. Unity and solidarity will save lives and prevent communities and economies from falling into catastrophic debt and dysfunction. In my country, the peace gains that we have made, consolidation of democracy, and the consolidation of peace are now put at risk with this pandemic. The challenges ahead are clear, and our discussion will just explore the data that we have now to better understand what is required in our recovery. Which brings us to today. We will hear a presentation by Development Initiatives on new analysis on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on aid, including what might happen to global ODA levels. We will then hear from Oxfam on their call to action to raise urgently needed funds to help the most vulnerable countries manage the crisis, limit the outbreak, and reshape the future of aid for more equal and resilient societies. We look forward to a rich discussion and encourage you to submit your questions and comments in the chat box at the bottom of your screens. Following the presentations, we will then, and reactions by our panelists, We will then open the floor for Q&A. Our team will collect all your questions and comments throughout the discussion, and feel free to start whenever appropriate to share your thoughts with the participants. With that, it is now my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Bob Rae, the permanent representative of Canada, who will provide opening remarks. As you all know, Ambassador Rae is also the co-chair of the Financing for Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond Initiative, FFDI, and the co-facilitator for the LDC 5 process. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophia. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today and to have an opportunity to share some thoughts and perspectives. It's a busy time as we go from Zoom to Zoom, but I really wanted just to give a fairly simple message to everyone. We know that in the last year, the advanced economies of the world have literally thrown away the rule book in their determination to ensure that their populations do not go into deep poverty as a result of the impact of COVID-19 and the measures that are being taken to fight the virus. So the stimulus, it's worth remembering, has been worth about 26% of the collective GDP in the advanced world, advanced economies. In the less developed economies, the average is about 6%, but for the least developed countries, who, as Sophia has pointed out, I'm working now with Bangladesh on this year's negotiations on the LDC 5 process. We know that number is even smaller. So you throw these numbers around, but these numbers, what they really mean is that the wealthier countries are doing the best they can to ensure, if you like, to provide the necessary social insurance for their people. And the rest of the world does not have the fiscal capacity to do that. They don't have the wealth, they don't have the room to do it, they don't have the means to do it because of the way the world economy now works. And as Secretary General Guterres has pointed out, that same situation applies to the vaccine and to access to the vaccine. So we now can talk about some countries approaching the light at the end of the proverbial tunnel, but other countries are right smack in the middle of the tunnel. And in some cases, like Brazil, the tunnel is just getting terrible. And so we have to come to grips with this growing inequality and with this very different perspective from a global point of view. And it is really important for us to remember that development assistance, both humanitarian assistance and development assistance more broadly, is a critical part of the global system of trying to offset the impact of this inequality, which has been magnified by COVID. I don't like to boast, not too much anyway, and it's not much to boast about, but I can say with some pride that Canada has resisted the trend that has been adopted by some to lower the amount of ODA because government's budgets are stressed by this extensive insurance being given to their own people. And we've gone up about 7.5% compared to 2019, which is a record high for us of over $5 billion US, which is a number that's beyond where we've been before. But I can also tell you that I'm communicating with my own government, and we've got a budget coming next week that we'll see whether and there's been any success in saying that we have to stay that course, and we can't go on the other side of the equation. And the figures show that there's been a 10% increase in ODA by France, significant increases from a number of others, including Finland, Germany, Iceland, Hungary, Norway, Slovakia, Sweden, and Switzerland. So Canada is part of a group of countries that have stayed on a certain path and stayed on a certain course. I'm glad that we're doing it. But we need to understand that maintaining this is absolutely critical to vaccine distribution and vaccine production and vaccine access. And it's absolutely critical to economic recovery from the impact of COVID-19. I think Sophia has described very well the challenge we have in fighting this gap and in dealing with it in a progressive way. But I can say that after 40 years of engagement in the political process in my own country and globally, this fight is worth fighting. It's really critical. We're dealing with the impact that are if we fail to act, the number of people who will be faced famine, who will face enormous hardship, whose countries will not be able to pay their bills, will not be able to meet their needs. That risk is not just a risk; it's going to become a reality. And yet, we also have the option of creating an alternative reality, which is actually the path that we have to get on, so that we can reinforce the Sustainable Development Goals, reinforce the need to deal with climate change, and yes, reinforce the need to deal with poverty and with inequality. And with that message, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I just wanted to pick up on one point. For me, when we speak about these challenges, it's important to know that it's actually really happening now in some of these countries where, vaccine access, equity, all of that distribution, it's not, people are not getting it. My own country is that very example. And we're really, really on the brink right now. And Timor-Leste is a country that's been lauded as a success story of the United Nations, best practices in terms of modeling behavior, etc., laws, rules, but all of that is just literally about to be wiped clean from the slate, and a country without debt, by the way, and with all sorts of challenges that are unrelated but now compounded by this pandemic. Thank you so much, and I know, Ambassador, you have to run to many more Zoom meetings, but I do know from you that you're a solutions person, and I've appreciated hearing you throughout in the various virtual tours that I've taken to hear that you're a very practical person, and I appreciate your participation today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Right, so now we move to the section where we hear some presentation on the research, and I wanted and am very pleased to introduce Amy Dodd, who is the Head of Engagement at Development Initiatives. Amy, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you, Ambassador Ray. I think you, well, you did my job of sort of introducing some of the challenge, both you and Sophia. I think in really highlighting this huge challenge we're facing. I think your point, Sophia, that this is very real. It's something that's happening right now, I think is really critically important. And it's not just important to kind of dealing with the challenge of COVID as serious and urgent as that is, but it's also about getting back on track with Agenda 2030, which we know was already a challenge even before 2020. We weren't exactly progressing in the direction or as quickly in the direction as we wanted to. So I think shifting that narrative, overcoming some of the challenges of COVID, shifting that narrative and getting back on track with Agenda 2030 is going to require real change, real action. And that is sort of why I wanted to talk about aid today. And I think as Ambassador Ray has clearly laid out, it's a really critically important resource in this context. It might be relatively small compared to some other things. And I think there's rightly really serious conversations going on around all the different forms of financing that we need to be mobilizing, thinking about the really serious debt concerns that are growing. But we do need to recognize that aid, effective use of aid, is going to be at least an important part of the short-term solution, and particularly for the poorest people and places. So if we could click forward one slide. So as other speakers have highlighted, we are seeing years of progress reversed. At least 100 million people pushed back into extreme poverty last year due to the pandemic, as well as seeing another 20 million people pushed back below what any of us would consider some sort of bare minimum subsistence level. So we've seen another 20 million people pushed below the $1 a day extreme poverty line, which I think is really an extreme one to try and consider. And the effects of this is again, I think you were saying, Sophia, very rightly, that they're very real. They're impacts that are happening in people's lives and they're living and experiencing them. So we've seen, you know, loss of income for those who are already struggling. Unsurprisingly, those who already live in poverty have felt the impacts of this the worst. We've seen children missing out on critical years of education, declining access to healthcare, growing hunger. And next slide, please. I think it's important to note that these are also relatively more concentrated in the poorest places. So I've used LDCs as an example. As we all know, LDC 5 is coming up, and I think that's a really important context for us to be thinking about in this conversation. But we know LDCs are only about 14% of the global population, but there are a quarter of those who were pushed into extreme poverty last year, and half of those who were pushed below that $1 a day line. I think that to me really exemplifies the sort of the very acute challenge that we're seeing in some places. Next slide. I also wanted to talk very briefly, at least, about the broader financing context, because I think we're seeing a really serious hit on all sources of financing. And I wanted to highlight here the impact this is having on countries' own financing, on domestic financing, which is probably without doubt actually the most important resource for sustainable development, but one that really has taken a hit in the context of the crisis. We can see that the impact of that has probably been a little bit more acute in sort of high income countries or relatively less poor countries. But I think the impact for the poorest countries, and again, I've used LDCs in this example, is really quite severe. We can see this sort of growing gap. So while the hit is less severe in terms of, you know, absolute volumes of money lost, we can see that other countries are going to be recovering relatively more quickly and sort of growing that path. We're going to see what the IMF has been talking about as this great divergence between these developed countries and other countries. And I think that's a really important one to consider as we're thinking about the recovery as well. We have a potential to kind of shift this and change this and do something differently. But I think this helps us in terms of thinking about where we most need to be targeting those scarce ODA resources. So you're saying, Sophia, things like remittances, receipts from tourism, unsurprisingly, foreign direct investment have all also taken a serious hit. And again, for many of the poorest countries, these are sources of external financing on which they are sort of disproportionately reliant. I won't talk about it in detail, and I know it's been discussed in many other events around FFD, but debt is a really serious and growing concern. And I think the impact that that's going to have, the constraining impact that's going to have on countries' domestic finance is going to be quite severe for many, many years to come at this point. So aid has a really vital role to play, not just in responding to these sort of negative trends and sort of ensuring a faster recovery, but really in terms of targeting those places where it's most needed. Next slide. I also wanted to talk a little bit, I know we've just had the OECD DAC statistics come out, so apologies I haven't managed to put that into a slide in the last 2 hours, but I think there are some interesting top lines to reflect on from there. Some countries, as Ambassador Ray was saying, such as Canada, have increased their ODA, such that we've seen overall about a $5 billion increase in ODA last year, which is not to be scoffed at and definitely something important, but I think we do need to see it in context of the scale of need that we're seeing. So that sort of 3.5% increase is great, but it's also a reflection of quite varied performance within donors, where we've had some donors increasing and some donors cutting at the same time. My own country, the UK, is probably a great example of those cuts, where we know there's been billions cut from the aid budget this year, and many billions more to come. Many billions more to come over the coming years. So we wanted to look at, you know, one of the things DI has been doing over the last year is to try and build a much more real-time picture of this, because obviously we want to be responding more currently to the challenges as they're emerging and building this more sort of detailed sense of what's happening in a kind of month-by-month basis. So we generally looked at commitments, unlike what we've seen in the DAC stats that just came out. And I think commitments are interesting because they tell us something about how donors, how institutions are responding, what kind of policy choices are they making right now. This obviously doesn't cover, the IATI data that we've used for this doesn't cover every single donor because they don't all report to IATI, but I think it gives us an interesting and evolving sense of what's happening to ODA right now. So looking at bilateral donors, looking at their commitments and sort of what they're planning to spend, we can see the picture is actually relatively similar to what happened with spending last year. It's relatively stagnated. And again, that sort of more interesting picture is when you look underneath that at sort of how individual donors are acting. So while some are increasing, including notably, for example, Sweden, New Zealand, Belgium, although some of those are relatively smaller donors, and some are cutting at the same time. So we're looking at a sort of balanced picture of ODA going forward, where we aren't expecting to see really significant growth unless there's sort of a change of direction at this point in time. The story with IFIs, which is why I highlighted it on this slide, I think is really very different. While the spending last year went up quite substantially, IFIs spent an extra $14 billion. We can see that this sort of long-term trend of more IFI spending is likely to continue. IFI commitments last year more than doubled to over 60 billion US dollars. And within that, we can see a really important increase from the World Bank at about 62%, but the Asian Development Bank increasing by almost 500%, which I think is really quite a significant one. An important fact to note here, I think, is that this is coming mostly in the form of loans, which is something I'll go into in a little bit more detail later, but I think in the context of the broader financing conversation, that's an important one to note. Next slide, please. So looking at where ODA is going, I think this is at least as important, if not more important, than the question of how much there is. So targeting, if you look at the data that we were seeing last year in terms of how these institutions are targeting their commitments, we don't really see a significant improvement coming. Bilateral donors continue to allocate their aid in broadly the same way as they did before, with just under half of it going to countries with relatively higher poverty rates. But IFIs, we could just click through the next two, thank you. IFIs, which are substantially growing their kind of ODA commitments at the same time, but we're seeing much less prioritization of those places where poverty is most acute. So for countries where over 20% of the populations live in extreme poverty, where they used to see about half of IFI commitments, now they're seeing just under 30%. The same is true if you look at things like country income levels. Low-income countries have not seen the commitments from IFIs continue to increase. And I think this is sort of borne out in the latest DAC data that we saw as well, where ODA spending in low-income countries last year actually declined, but increased very significantly to upper middle-income countries. And next slide. So again, looking at LDCs, we see was really quite a similar picture. And as I said, I think this is a particularly important one to look at because we're heading into LDC 5, which is an opportunity for us to kind of accelerate action to really sort of raise the level of our ambitions. But looking at what the data is telling us about, ODA commitments, I don't think we're seeing that reflected in the data. So what we can see is that bilateral donors, again, relatively similar distribution, just under half of their ODA is going to LDCs. This isn't a bad thing, but it means we're not seeing that kind of increased focus, increased targeting towards those places with the most severe challenges that we might have expected in this context. Similarly, IFIs are increasing the overall pot of what they're going to be spending over the coming years, but a shrinking proportion of that is going to be going to LDCs. So from just about 58% down to just over a third. Next slide. We also looked at what's changed in terms of the focus in terms of sectors. So what is ODA being spent on in the context of the crisis? And here, as you can see, there's actually a relatively mixed picture. I think some key takeaways for me are that some of the most critical sectors like health and education have been relatively protected. At the same time, some areas like infrastructure have, maybe unsurprisingly in the context of the crisis and the sort of the very urgent needs, but they have seen a sort of relative deprioritization. Interestingly, some areas like humanitarian assistance, which we've talked about a little bit already today, which we know is very important in the context of the crisis, and humanitarian need, humanitarian appeals have hit an all-time high in 2020. Yet at the same time, we're seeing that relatively deprioritized in bilateral ODA commitments. So I don't think there's an easy answer to sort of what the right distribution of this looks like. Obviously, investing in health in the context of the pandemic, and also, frankly, as a really important long-term investment in development is really critical. But it does raise some questions about whether or not that's going to come at the expense of kind of appropriate levels of financing for other sectors, water and sanitation, infrastructure, as I mentioned before, all of which are very important. Next slide, please. Looking at IFIs, I think a subtext to all of this, which is important to remember, is, as I said, all of this, they're spending a lot more ODA over coming years. So all of these sectors across the board have actually seen increases in volume terms. And what we wanted to look at was a little bit, where has that relative focus been? So where have they been shifting in and prioritizing more or less? And overall, I think what you see is a little bit of a shift to a sort of social focus, as well as very much to governance and security have clearly been seeing big increases. Health didn't actually shift in terms of its overall proportion of IFI ODA commitments, but actually still saw over 100% growth in volume terms. As I said, governance and security obviously saw some quite serious increases, over 400%. Education more than doubled. Other social services, which includes really critical things like social protection, also grew fourfold. Some sectors though, again, like agriculture, infrastructure, water and sanitation, again, all saw relatively less focus or sort of relative deprioritization. So again, I think that sort of poses some challenging questions, not least because most of this is coming in the form of loans, which is also something I should note. Actually, it was an interesting fact that came out of the DAC stats that just came out. It was a really quite significant increase in lending from bilateral donors. I think it's gone up to almost a quarter of ODA last year, 22%, up from 17%, which is really a very significant increase in the context of a sort of looming debt crisis. So next slide. On that very question, we wanted to understand a little bit what's happening to IFI ODA. As I said, about 98% of it comes in the form of loans. And I think we should probably note as a sidebar to that, it is concessional, it's better than market rates. So it's probably better than the terms on which countries might have been able to access finance on the open market. And I think there's no question it probably really will help in terms of creating some of that fiscal space, that capacity to respond that we've been talking about. But nonetheless, it is banking longer term problems and also sort of means a decreasing proportion of the total ODA going to the poorest countries is going to be going as grants, which I think is a challenge. So in that sense, where it's targeted is really very important. And while the majority of ODA loans from IFIs continue to go to lower middle income countries at about 2/3, upper middle income countries saw quite a significant increase. What we can see with this chart is that actually those countries who are struggling with debt as an issue have also seen an increase. So countries in debt distress saw a 22% increase in ODA loans, and those at high risk of debt distress also saw a fairly significant increase. As I said, I think this really does pose some challenging questions around the question of debt sustainability. And last slide. So I suppose I wanted to finish with a couple of top-line reflections. There's a lot of data, it's evolving every day, so this is a picture that's shifting and changing, and I think that's quite an important point to reflect. We have time to shift and change these, and nowhere better to talk about this than at the UNFFD conference. But some really critical takeaways from my perspective and some things I think we need to consider how we address. ODA is not retargeting to where it's most needed. We know needs are greatly increased in the context of the current crisis, and I think that's a real problem and one we need to think about how we address right now. So even before the pandemic, we know LDCs were facing serious challenges, including things like a liquidity crisis. Poverty was increasingly concentrated in some of the more challenging contexts like fragile or conflict-affected sites. But all of this means we were pretty off track. And I think getting back on track is going to mean thinking much more clearly about how we target ODA both to need, but also thinking about that in the context of the broader financing picture and where other forms of financing aren't going to fit in or aren't going to be able to increase. Secondly, no question, IFIs have really provided something I think important in the short term and probably equally important over coming years in terms of liquidity, but also I think it's worth reflecting they have really stepped up in the context of the current crisis, significantly increasing their ODA in response. The counter to that is that it does create some challenges. IFIs, by their very nature and design, have quite a different focus to bilateral donors and multilaterals. And I think it's arguably one that's a little bit less sharply focused on poverty and on those most challenging contexts. That increase in ODA loans, I think, is really concerning. And so this all comes in a context where we need to be considering how we recapitalize, how we replenish these IFIs. And I think we've got a limited or relatively limited pot of ODA, which isn't going to be growing significantly. So how we make that relative allocation decision is quite important. And finally, we know we need to get aid levels up. This is always a challenging conversation. It's not an easy one. And I think, yes, we've seen some increases last year, but I think it is worth noting we only saw a $5 billion increase in response to what is probably the worst crisis any of us have faced at a global level. So not sure how we quite get around that question, but I think, reflecting on, those donors who have committed to increases, maintaining those is going to be important and through the coming years, I think Ambassador Ray was referring to, but also really thinking about how for those countries who have made cuts or who are planning to make cuts, how they sort of get back on track is going to be really critical. So thank you very much. I should say we'll be publishing a more in-depth report on this in the coming weeks, so we hope to share that all with you. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amy, and look forward to getting that research paper. But now I need to shift over to, let me introduce Abby Maxman, CEO of Oxfam America, who will provide some reflections on what she has just heard. Abby, the urgency is clear. Over to you. We need a paradigm shift, and now. So your reflections, thank you.
Indeed. Thanks, Sophia. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you again for having me here today. And thanks to the organizers, UNF and DI, for this opportunity. As you note, Sophia, it's a paradigm shift is needed. And Amy's presentation paints a bleak picture of how well we as a global community have stepped up to the plate when it comes to aid. Our world is in crisis, an inequality crisis, a climate crisis, a justice crisis, and a political crisis. And the most vulnerable populations in countries will disproportionately bear the weight of these crises unless there's a change and the UN and other key actors intervene significantly. We saw that in the presentation just now. The Sustainable Development Goals have set a blueprint for change, but inequality has severely derailed progress. Now, Oxfam has seen this firsthand in the more than 70 countries we work in worldwide. The economic needs brought on by the pandemic are truly unparalleled, as Amy already acknowledged. Before the pandemic, the SDGs faced an estimated annual funding gap of $2.5 trillion. Now, if you add that to the additional $1 trillion needed as a direct result of the pandemic and the estimated private finance gap to developing countries, we're looking at a nearly $4.2 trillion gap. And we cannot rely on private sector investment to fix this crisis. We need to talk more about where public development finance is being provided and who is setting the rules on who can access those resources. So as we just discussed just this morning, the OECD DAC released their 2020 aid figure. And in 2020, in the aggregate, rich countries spent 0.32% of their gross national income on aid, which was up from 0.30% in 2019. And while this is welcome news, Amy's presentation confirms that lower income countries are being hit the hardest, exacerbated by a contraction in available domestic resources. And worse, LICs have received a lower share of available concessional resources. And while the data Amy just showed that IFIs have stepped up and most of the ODA increases seen in response to the crisis can be attributed to them, but it also means donors have a responsibility when it comes time to replenish the IFIs. And we need to be bold on aid. We recently passed the 50th anniversary of the 0.7% commitment on official aid. And Oxfam has calculated that since this promise was made, the world's richest countries owe $5.7 trillion debt to the world's poorest people. Now, this is 9 times larger than sub-Saharan Africa's stock of external debt at the end of 2019. And if rich countries had kept their promise, aid budgets would have been boosted by $190 billion in 2020 alone, more than enough for low and lower middle income countries to vaccinate their entire population and guarantee basic education for all. Now, as Amy made clear, we need to make the best use of ODA to build back better and fairer. The pandemic has shown how deep and growing inequalities undermine our ability to confront existential threats. Putting the fight against inequality at the center of development cooperation is key to beat poverty, support a just recovery, and to build more resilient societies. And this means a few things. A truly feminist aid that puts gender equality and women's rights at its heart. More ODA spending on universal public services in health, education, and social protection. More ODA that supports more progressive tax systems, a commitment we're happy to see in the Addis Tax Initiative Declaration 2025 launched this morning. Enhanced support to active citizens holding their governments accountable, and breaking away from using aid to serve donors' own economic agendas and from backing the privatization of health and education, which we know worsens inequality. Now, the moral debt is immeasurable. These trillions in unpaid aid could have helped eradicate hunger and extreme poverty. And if ever there was a time for governments to meet this pledge, this is it. While we're here to talk about ODA, we cannot ignore how aid is intricately linked to how we respond to the global crisis. Now let's take a focus on vaccines, for example. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only lifted the veil on how unequal our world really is, it's deepened those inequalities, with poor and marginalized people bearing the brunt. Emerging vaccines represented a critical way out of this global public health crisis and economic nightmare, but only if everyone has access to treatment. Increasing aid is vital to provide COVID-19 vaccines, tests, and treatments to developing countries and to shore up their health systems and capacity to manufacture vaccines. But this is a drop in the ocean compared to needs and should under no circumstances replace international commitments to share patents. Oxfam is working in coalition with others to fight for a people's vaccine that is free, fairly distributed, and fully accessible to all. And we need COVAX fully funded with more ambitious targets for coverage to low-income countries. But this simply cannot be treated as a fundraising exercise where rich countries donate leftover, substandard vaccines to countries with less wealth or political heft. UN member states must do more to regulate the power of pharmaceutical companies to hoard life-saving intellectual property in the name of profit-seeking. This means unlocking the technology through supporting a WTO TRIPS waiver, sharing the technology and know-how through CTAP, and investing now in regional vaccine hubs across the world to defeat this and future pandemics. But I want to talk now about debt. And Amy called that out in the previous presentation. We also need to be bolder to stop the hemorrhaging of money from developing countries through debt repayments. Our research indicates that in 2019, 64 countries were spending more on servicing external government debt payments than on health, with many countries also spending more on debt payments than on social protection and public education. Only 46 out of 73 of the poorest countries applied for their bilateral debt repayments to be suspended in 2020, saving them $5.7 billion. And this is triple the amount that Uganda, Malawi, and Zambia combined spend on their annual public health budget. And all debt repayments, public, private, and multilateral, must be canceled, not simply suspended through at least 2023. The UN must establish a sovereign debt workout mechanism, and private debt cancellation would be achieved through a binding common framework. Doing too little, which is what is happening now, will only make the crisis deeper and recovery slower and worse. While we're encouraged by the recent news about SDR allocation, we need to continue to see dedication to this useful resource beyond this year. And we hope donor countries are able to creatively use their resources to boost allocations to low-income member states. Finally, I want to talk about climate finance. International climate finance is a cornerstone of global cooperation on climate change. And over a decade ago, developed countries committed to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 to support developing countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change and reduce their emissions. However, Oxfam's analysis raises concerns about how developed countries account for their climate finance and how it is being allocated. Even though public climate finance is reported to be $59.5 billion per year, the value of climate support to developing countries is estimated to be only a third of that reported. Climate finance needs to be reported in a way that better reflects its real value and the real effort made by developed countries. We're also failing to allocate grant-based support for adaptation to low-income, climate-vulnerable countries and communities, and the share of public climate finance going to LCDs is only 21%, and to small island developing states, only 3%. At the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, we must commit to an urgent, significant scale-up of adaptation and grant-based finance. Now, only through global cooperation will we be able to respond to this crisis and build a more sustainable and equal future. The Financing for Development Forum is bringing together different global actors, from Global South and Northern governments, civil society, and the private sector to ensure all countries are on task to create a more equitable and sustainable future. And we hope that next year, UN member states will agree to move forward with planning a fourth high-level financing for development conference as promised in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. We all have a role to play in changing the way we finance development, and a world in crisis requires nothing less. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Abby. I'm now going to turn to our illustrious panelists and introduce them one by one, and then I will give the floor, starting off with Ambassador Ligoya. First of all, His Excellency Perks Clemency Ligoya, Permanent Representative of Malawi to the United Nations, and also Chair of the LDCs Group. We have Heidi Schroders-Fox, Director of the United Nations Office of the High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Countries, and Small Island Developing States. And you also take the prize for having the most difficult or a very mouthful of a title to get through, Heidi. And Jean-Paul Adam, Director of the Technology, Climate Change, and Natural Resource Management Division of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And we've met before, Mr. Minister, my apologies for not recognizing you. Small world, welcome. So let me start by giving the floor to Ambassador Ligoya. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Sophia. I've learned today that you come from Timor-Leste. Yeah.
And you're advocating for Timor-Leste, right? Graduation, etc. in your hat. But over to you, Ambassador.
Right. Let me thank Abby and Ami for the presentations made. Very clear message. We need to do more. The world is facing this crisis that we've never faced in our lifetimes. And special situations like these need special measures to be taken. I have listened attentively, and I have the following remarks. First of all, inequality is on the increase. Listening to the Secretary General yesterday, he said the biggest companies have amassed more than 5 trillion in profits when the rest of the world is getting poorer. We need to find ways to address this increasing inequality. I've heard the financing gap, that if all the countries were to respect the ODA commitments, the gap, they would have given 5.7 trillion to LDCs and developing countries. That would be sufficient for all vaccines and other requirements currently. I have seen in the presentations that money spent on governance and security is much more than money spent, and is increasing, than money spent in health and education. This is, to me, an anomaly, and we need to see what it is that we should prioritize. And if we go according to our 2030 agenda, we need to relook at the distribution of our expenditures. I would be more comfortable to have in this crisis, a health crisis, more money spent on health, education, than what is presently the case. It has also been said that concessional aid is lower. Let me agree with that. When we come to climate financing, it is said that currently about 60% of the financing that goes to LDCs are in form of loans and not grants as was before. Again, this has to be looked into. The call for debt cancellation and not only suspension is something we as LDCs have called for since we issued our statement on recovering from COVID-19. We appreciate all the measures that are being taken, the 650 billion units of accounts of SDR, the other measures by the World Bank and the IMF, the common framework by the G20. All those are appreciated, but they fall short of the call made by the civil society in this FFD forum, calling for 3 trillion of SDR allocation. For the vaccines, it surprises me that the vaccine hoarding is costing as much as 9 trillion, as said by the Secretary General yesterday, and that the current production of vaccines and the amounts allocated to the developing countries through the COVAX facility will only cater for 20% of the populations in the LDCs. What happens to the 80% who will not have the vaccines? I think the international community needs to be more serious in looking at finding solutions for everybody, because 20% coverage is not good enough in our countries. I have listened with interest from Ambassador Bob Ray with the list of countries that have increased their ODA, beginning with his own country, Canada, France, Finland, Norway, Germany, Sweden, New Zealand. This is good news to hear, and we hope more countries will follow suit, as opposed to countries that we know are backtracking from the commitment of 0.7% to 0.5% of GNI. Domestic financing needs to be prompted up. However, given the limited fiscal space in the developing countries, LDCs, there is a limit to which you can raise domestic resources. If you have one cow to milk, you can't milk it forever. You have to have a limit of how much you can milk that cow. And that's the situation countries are in. So we repeat our call for the DSSI to go further than the present provisions. And we understand why even middle-income countries are asking for coverage under the DSSI because they are in the same situation that most of our countries are in. And again, there is the question that we are expected to start servicing our debt in 2022. Is the assumption that in 2022, we will be over with all the problems that we have now? I don't think so. The crisis is unfolding, and with new dimensions coming in, the consequences of this crisis are going to be with us for not less than 3, 4, 5 years to recover. And therefore, the need for the G20 to relook at the moratorium to go beyond the 60%. I realize time is not on our side, but I want to thank Oxfam and all civil society, UN Foundation, for their contributions in this FFD forum, and invite all of you to join us in the LDC 5 preparation. Your contribution, especially the civil society, Oxfam and others, Jubilee, your contributions will be vital because we need to come up with a document that will take us to 2030, and there is no room for error, otherwise we will miss the whole 2030 agenda. I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ligoya. And now I'm going to hand the floor over to you, Heidi.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you, dear Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's really great to be here, and thank you to UN Foundation, Oxfam, and Development Initiatives for organizing this very important event. It truly is important, and it was great listening to the previous speakers, and also the research that Amy is doing on this was really interesting, and greatly appreciate the focus that we have on the most vulnerable countries, LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS. And what I feel as I was listening to Ambassador Ligoya, Abby and Amy and Ambassador Ray is that we are all speaking from the same notes. The messages are very, very much the same. So it makes my duty very easy, and also I can be very brief. So if we look at the Secretary General's report on the Istanbul Programme of Action of 2021, the average share of gross national income that was provided as ODA to LDCs from all of the donors declined from 0.1% in 2011 to 0.09% in 2019. And this is, of course, well below the Istanbul Programme of Action targets, which was 0.15 to 0.2 of GNI. And of course, Amy's research just had even more recent figures. The overall numbers, if I understood, are going up, but the proportion of the LDCs is not going up. And this is a real challenge for us. So the fulfillment of these commitments is crucial to significantly increase the availability of finance. And in fact, total official ODA flows to the least developed countries were higher than foreign FDI, foreign direct investment, or remittances. And at this time of COVID crisis, the international community has an opportunity to reaffirm its commitments to LDCs, the group of countries that are most dependent on ODA as their main source of external public finance. And Something that caught my ear very much and that worries me is what Ambassador Ray really started with, because he was mentioning that advanced countries are throwing out the rule book to protect their own. And this is really something that the numbers that I was quoting are pre-COVID. So what will happen right now when we have the statistics of the current statistics, and in the future, it is a big, big worry. So the pandemic has greatly reduced the fiscal space of the LDCs at a time of great need, and has really led to increased poverty and inequality, and it threatens to undo hard-won previous progress. Sophia was talking about that when we were talking about the case of Timor-Leste. The principle of leaving no one behind gains even greater relevance in the world ravaged by devastating effects of the pandemic. ODA is a crucial tool to fight poverty, reduce vulnerability, and promote greater equality. So thus the key message here for me is that what I think is crucial, that to better support LDAs, ODA commitments should not only be fulfilled, but scaled up, and scaled up considerably. Accelerating progress in the LDCs requires a substantial increase in technical and financial resources. Mobilizing additional finance to the LDCs requires that we think creatively about how to tap into resources that can offer predictable and sustained funding to match the level of ambition of LDCs and their partners. Blended finance, for example, can enable LDCs to foster economic and social transformation in an inclusive way. And this means creating adequate instruments and fund them also adequately, but also supporting national institutions such as development banks and financial and technical point of view, so that they can mobilize private investment. And this, I think, was also pointed out by Ambassador Ligoya. As we look into the COVID recovery, LDCs must be supported with access to vaccines. That is obvious, and we all must come together and work on that, but on broader financial resources. LDCs will need the support to preserve the livelihoods of millions of people who have lost their source of income. And at the national level, putting special attention on the most disadvantaged and vulnerable is crucial for the equitable recovery. Supporting women and girls in the recovery is an effort that requires coordinated efforts of national and local authorities, but also scaled up support from the multilateral system and developing partners. And before I say a few words on the upcoming LDC 5, maybe I'll bring in also an interesting element, because this is something that is ongoing, the discussion very much within the UN, and I think that it's an important element of the overall discussion on development financing. And that is the attempts to come together with the definition of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index that would provide a basis for further funding and taking into consideration vulnerability as a basis when we are looking into funding opportunities. This has been, of course, discussed for a long time, but it seems to be one of those issues where everybody agrees that it needs to be done. Vulnerability is absolutely an element that should be considered when we look into financing, but how to do it then is, once we get into the technicalities of it, we all have different views, but hopefully during the spring, the UN can come up with some new ideas, new thinking on this, but this is really a discussion that all of us, hopefully you had the opportunity this morning to follow the discussion of the webinar that DESA organized, but it really is something worth looking into. But from my office point of view, of course, the most important thing right now is the looking into the upcoming LDC 5 conference that will be held in Doha, Qatar in January 2022, and that where all UN member states and the whole international community, civil society, very, very importantly, will come together at the highest level and decide on what will be the priorities for the least developed countries and the international community for the LDC, new decade of action for the LDCs. So the opportunity really is there to focus our effort to equitable recovery of the LDC in Doha. So I would really like to encourage you, like also Ambassador Ligoya did, to participate in not only the conference, but the preparations. The program of action will be negotiated in the upcoming, starting with the first PrepCom in May and then in July and further on. And I would really invite everybody to come up with some new ideas. We really need some new ideas. Of course, we need also strengthening the existing mechanisms, and we need really strong partnerships of all working together towards helping the LDCs. A renewed partnership with LDCs must go beyond the idea of just enabling LDCs to graduate from the category, and it should really identify and agree on concrete measures capable of giving the tools to the people and the governments of LDCs to build a future of prosperity, building on their own potential and their own strengths. So let's be ambitious, address the urgent recovery efforts, build back better, build back inclusively, and really to aim together for a decade of transformative action for the LDCs. So this would be my message. We need even stronger commitment from all of us. And I agree with Ambassador Ligoya that we will not, once we come out of this immediate impacts of the COVID pandemic, that is only the beginning, and we will need to work together even stronger after that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heidi. And no doubt about it, the LDC 5 is one of those opportunities, and let's hope for the ambition that you call for and thinking outside of the box that's required at this critical juncture. Now it's my pleasure to introduce and to give the floor to Jean-Paul for your reflections. Over to you. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And it's great to meet up with you again, and also to participate, I think, in what is a very interesting discussion so far. And I'd like to congratulate the presenters and the work that has been done on the reports, because I think this really helps us to move forward in terms of our understanding of the resources that are required and the effort that is required, not only from partners, but I would say also from countries in Africa, from LDCs, from vulnerable countries, from small island developing states. How can we address this conversation in a very meaningful way? Firstly, from the African perspective, a few figures to understand the scale of the issue. The work done by the ECA has shown that if we had just $100 billion invested last year in 2020, we would have averted a recession. And there was significant resources that were mobilized last year. There were, in fact, $56 billion that were pledged. That includes, among the $56 billion that were pledged, includes grants, it includes soft loans, various means of support, and as well as the DSSI. But of the 56 billion that were pledged, only 35 billion were actually disbursed by December of last year. So we're always seeing this discrepancy between money that is pledged and money then which is actually allocated, and which countries can actually use to respond. The impact on African countries is even more severe in this sense, because they have not had the fiscal space to be able to respond using their own resources. And at the height of the crisis last year, African countries were averaging at -8% in terms of their fiscal deficit. So some countries obviously had much bigger deficits. And that's also in a context where African countries are plagued by, unfortunately, long-term low tax to GDP ratios. So the ability to mobilize finance nationally has been further reduced. And this is in a context as well where having the finance to invest in the key areas has been limited. And again, work from ECA has shown that the gap in terms of achieving the SDGs has risen to $92.8 billion per year. And this is the kind of scale of money that needs to be raised. And it sounds like a lot until we realize that the US stimulus was 1.9 trillion. So 100 billion a year for Africa, for the whole of Africa, would more or less allow African countries to respond to the immediate crisis and get their economies back on track. The second element that I would like to touch on is the challenges around our current way of looking at development, which is really focused on GDP per capita. And GDP per capita is particularly inefficient because it essentially creates an artificial definition of where poverty lies. It doesn't define whether someone has access to healthcare. It doesn't define what risks that individual may face on a daily basis. It also fails to take into account some of the other factors that are affecting countries' development. Again, work done by the ECA recently on the impact of climate change has shown that African countries are spending, in many cases, an average of 5% of their GDP responding to climate-related natural disasters. In some extreme cases, that rises to 9%. And the projections that we've done going forward are that at 2 degrees of warming, African countries are expected to lose up to 5% of their GDP as well, as an average. But in extreme cases, and if you go up to just 1 degree of warming, 3 degrees of warming, in the Sahel, you will see up to 15% of GDP loss linked directly to climate change by 2030. So the impact of climate change on economies in Africa is dramatic. GDP per capita is not necessarily capturing the impact of these external factors. And I would like to echo the points made by Heidi that it's absolutely necessary that we look at a vulnerability index, one which is multidimensional and which therefore allows us to better target where investments should be made that have the most impact. And I think there's benefit as well in saying that where investment is, the sectors in which investment is targeted has as great an impact as well as simply looking at just in which countries. And of course, health and education are usually probably the first two, where investment is, I would say, even you don't need to question that investment needs to go there. And the ECA, we've recently done a green recovery report for Africa, where we've looked at where would you invest your money to get the maximum impact in terms of economic growth, but from the lens particularly of job creation and value addition throughout the economy. And we've started with a series of case studies. One of the very interesting ones covered an LDC, which was DRC. And in DRC, it showed that by investing in green sectors, as opposed to fossil fuel-based sectors, and in particular, renewable energy, and this would be both at utility grade and microgrid, investing in food security based around climate smart agriculture, investing in nature-based solutions around reforestation, and investing in sustainable transport opportunities would create 130% more jobs than if you were to invest in the fossil fuel equivalent in the country. And it would also create 280% more value addition in the economy than if you were to invest in the fossil fuel-based equivalent in the country. So there's a very clear narrative which is emerging that by investing in the green sectors, we will actually enhance the quality of the recovery. And I think it's very important to look at where we put the investment as much as just which countries. And of course, we have to make sure that in particular, LDCs are not left behind. And I think this leads to the case as well of, I think it's Jonathan Glennie had mentioned this idea of global public investment, which I think is worth looking at, the priority sectors in which we really make the most impact. And to conclude, I would also say that as part of the solutions for the big gap in financing, first and foremost, we have to make sure that commitments are met. the 100 billion per year in terms of climate finance are delivered. And this is going to be one of the main asks from African countries at COP26. African countries are enhancing their NDCs, not necessarily all of them, but a number of them are. And they're expecting to also have the resources to be able to invest in those sectors. The other element I would mention is that it is important to look at opportunities that also reduce the cost of private sector financing, because this will also, and I think what was very interesting from the presentation is that we saw that there is quite a lot of resources that are going towards middle income countries, and that's increasing. And I would have to obviously look at the report in a little bit more detail, but there is an element that a lot of African countries, for example, that are now middle income or recently graduated, struggle to raise resources affordably and are having to go to the market. Now, in the current environment, so for example, Ghana went to the market, I think around 2 weeks ago, and they're paying 8% on their bond. And this is investment that they're looking to invest in the electricity sector. And they have some access to DSSI, they have some access to IFI resources, but the amounts don't add up. They need to get additional resources. And if you compare, there are similar countries in the Eurozone that have, I think, only one grade better in terms of their rating, are borrowing at below 1%. Of course, there are other factors, the fact that they have access to the European Central Bank and so on. I won't go into those details. But the high cost of private finance in countries that have market access is also, in a sense, diverting resources from where they could also be invested. So there are solutions around private sector investment, making that more affordable, de-risking. And one of the key elements that the ECA has been promoting is the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, which proposes using part of the SDRs for on-lending to reduce the cost of finance from the private sector into key areas that would be linked to the Paris Agreement, such as renewable energy, but also adaptation projects and projects that are linked to responding to COVID and the climate crisis. There's an opportunity to also explore debt swaps, and we noted that the IMF have recently indicated that this is something they would like to explore. And there's also an opportunity for SDG-linked bonds so that we can get more private sector finance into areas that could be financed using those resources. But I would like to stress once again, as my final point, that should not take the emphasis away from raising the grant resources that are needed, and in particular the climate financing that have been pledged. Thank you so much, and back to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Jean-Paul. I'm very conscious of the time, but I wanted to actually give the floor for a comment from one of our civil society participants, Vitalici Meha, who is Reality of Africa, Aid Africa, and a member of the civil society FFD major group. And Vitalici is going to come in just via sound because no video. Oh, we can see you. Welcome. Could you unmute?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure you can see me. I look very bright from the side. So if you allow me, I can switch it off, or should I just continue?
It's fine, continue. We can see your shadow.
So thank you very much. And indeed, Sophia, thank you for the invitation, and also to the organizers. I think this is a very important topic and very timely indeed. I think as we consider this topic, we also need to be a bit more cognizant of the dynamics, especially at the national level, and with regard to how we are seeing, especially going back to what Ami had presented to us with regard to the statistics. I think one of the things that we are seeing is there's a lot of resources being channeled to multilateral institutions, and in this case, the World Bank and the IMF. As you know, these institutions don't just come to the country to give you money for the sake of it. There has to be a lot of structural reforms that are not necessarily very transparent and inclusive. And increasingly, even though we are getting access to these resources, but the conditions and the terms have become very restrictive, and they are not very accessible to the citizens. I remember last week in Nairobi here, the citizens asked the World Bank to tell us which companies got the tender for providing PPEs for COVID. And the response was, that is not in the interest of the bank. and the interest of the bank is much higher than the public interest. So you see, as citizens, we are increasingly feeling very ostracized in a manner that we cannot really exercise that democratic right to participate in the development process and how those development finances are mobilized. And I think, as everybody has seen, and also from Amy's presentation, you see a lot of, most of these countries are now in lower middle income or middle income there, and lots of ODA actually moving towards that direction. So until we improve transparency and accountability of these instruments, we are questioning how well these resources are being targeted to address development challenges. So I feel like we are still operating a lot on like it's business as usual, that we are not seeing how we mirror this coming from a crisis to stability. And even how countries themselves are discussing with their citizens how to manage to bring about stability. Because like I said, this is also mirrored in with these restriction measures that don't really allow for public participation in policy dialogue. So there is still a lot more of work to be done to translate these good ideas on how to mobilize resources and how to channel them, and really how to bring and put people at the center of this. Because we are not doing this for buildings. We are not doing this for collapsed systems. We are doing this to change livelihoods of the people. And until we bring them to the table, until we facilitate accountability instruments of these institutions, really to bring the citizens' voice to bear on how they operate and how they account, it is going to be very difficult. The last thing that I want to raise also is, how do we design a framework that also recognizes other stakeholders like China, India, and co? Because most of these countries, especially coming from Africa, I think all of us know that the level of investment of Chinese companies, whether state or otherwise, is high. And so until we start discussing how we also want to get them engaged, bring them to the table to really address the challenges of resource mobilization, resource utilization, but also resource accountability, I think we're going to have major problems. So I think that is a big issue that we think should be addressed. Lastly, I think what is very key is really understanding the role of the Bretton Woods institutions in shaping the direction of policy choices that the countries are going to make. I think that is going to be great. We know the implications of the structural adjustments before everything fell apart. And now we are giving them a blank check without necessarily putting in measures to make sure that the instruments are really going to spur development. I think it's something that we must make sure we keep tabs on and ensure that inequality aspects that might be exacerbated through their engagement, we have to keep our tabs on that. I thank you very much, Madam Chair, and sorry for taking a bit of your time. Thank you.
Not at all, and really appreciate the voice from the ground, Vitalici. And I 100% agree with you about having to factor in the national dynamics. And the statistics that Amy gave earlier on about the flipping of the channeling of funds to the governance and security, from my perspective for Timor-Leste, you need to invest in government, building, strengthening institutions of democracy, young country, post-conflict. That is critical in terms of having a successful delivery and outcome of for solutions for this crisis that we're in. So it's not one size fits all is probably the message. I'm cognizant of the time. I want to give Pin the opportunity to speak. So the questions that came through are going to be put on the chat, and really encourage you to respond via chat so that we can hear from our dear colleague, Harpender Collicott, the Executive Director of Development Initiatives, for her final reflections. Pin, over to you, and thank you so much for partnering with us today.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and thank you so much to every single person on this incredibly interesting panel who's spoken today. It's been a fascinating discussion and a very pertinent discussion to set us off this week as well. And also thank you to Oxfam and UN Foundation for co-partnering with development initiatives to bring this discussion to everyone. So, Sophia, you've given me the opportunity to try to summate a very rich and powerful discussion which we've had today. But I think what struck me most was actually the key areas around which there was so much agreement amongst this panel, and that was good to hear. But I hope that also means that as a result, we can come to some solutions and actions around some of the challenges we're facing. So the first big challenge is always to make sure we have agreement around the challenges, but now we must put our heads together and then also think of the critical areas where we can build solutions around this as well. And the other thing that was very evident for me was the need for us to be bolder and to do more. That message was very simple and clear throughout the discussion. And I know we had Abby talk about being bolder on ODA, being bolder on debt, and being bolder on mobilizing funding for climate finance as well. So being bold is obviously a very pertinent time. And we started off this discussion actually talking about how countries in response to the pandemics from 2020 have actually been incredibly bold, but particularly around public finance. And previous to the pandemic, we had had so much talk about the importance of private finance, but actually what the pandemic has shown is the critical importance of public finance, domestic and international public finance, particularly ODA for some of the least developed countries and others who are struggling to mobilize resources in light of a global pandemic. So we need a global response, and ODA has been playing an important role in part of that global response. But what's important is we need to be aware that we need to have short-term, immediate emergency response to the crisis, but we also need to have some more medium to longer-term measures that need to be developed alongside this, the short-term measures, because ultimately the consequences of the current crisis, but also the climate crisis we're all facing, and also the growing inequalities world over, are going to affect us for years to come, and we cannot try to address them through short-term measures. So long-term measures are pertinent for this. And so we started off with a bit of a positive message in the discussion around actually seeing some aggregate increases in ODA, and the critical message coming out is, number one, we need to make sure that those increases are sustained, but also they are sufficient. They're 3.5 in response to the need. Doesn't seem 3.5% increase of ODA doesn't seem to be sufficient in response to the need that we're facing. And this seems to be an occurring message across the board with regards to climate as well, that the need is growing, but the extent of financing we're mobilizing is not keeping pace with that change as well. And so we are having to be very pertinent about where those resources can and should go and how they should be targeted. And that brings me on to my second point, which is around data. And never before have policymakers called for and needed data in a real-time way to target communities most in need at a time of crises. And it's shown us that actually a lot of the data we rely on, data on people, those who are most affected, it's not good enough. It doesn't come at a pace that is fast enough to give us the ability to make decisions about the allocation of financing, to ensure that it's getting to the right people in the right way at the right time. And so more needs to be done in this area immediately to ensure that data is improved. And we heard calls from two of our speakers, two of our discussants actually today, on the importance of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index. And it's great to hear the importance of indices like these, which would help improve the quality of data around vulnerability, poverty, insecurity, but also inequality as well, to ensure that those who are most in need are benefiting from the resources. And my last point, I think one of our discussants, Jean-Paul, actually mentioned global public investment and the importance of looking at the future of the financing architecture. This has been a discussion myself and development initiatives alongside a number of others, including Jonathan Glenning, have been pushing forward on, is this concept of trying to actually reform the financing architecture as we go along, and not just to put that on hold. We need to be making urgent changes around the financing architecture to ensure it is fit for purpose for the future. And the COVID-19 pandemic and the struggles over the fair distribution of vaccines globally has underscored the stark limitations with the way that countries presently attempt to secure global public goods and protect our common global interests. It's just not good enough. And compounded with the trillion-dollar funding gaps we're facing on the Sustainable Development Goals, we know something needs to be done, and something needs to be done urgently. So I would definitely recommend that we look at some new big ideas, such as the global public investment idea, which is very much about creating a much more universal system in response to the challenges we're facing. One which addresses the power imbalances between North-South with the ODA system, and moves away from concepts of charity to shared purpose, universality, to tackle not just poverty, but inequality and unsustainability too. So in conclusion to that, I think the stakes are very high. This discussion and the discussions already happening as part of the forum this week really highlight that, but it's also a chance to take some real critical core actions that can drive progress forward to ensure that we're focusing on a fairer recovery, one that does not leave countries and people further behind, but actually sweeps them up and takes them with us as we move towards a world of the post-pandemic and looking to the future of 2032. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pin, and right on time. That terrific wrap up. Let me just thank everybody, those of you participating on this call. It's been a very, very rich conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Only highlights the role that we can all play in being advocates for change and to push this agenda forward. I'm sure we will have another round of conversations like this, and look forward to you joining us again. But for now, thanks so much. And thank you to our co-hosts, our panelists, our experts for being here today, for enriching us this afternoon with your thinking. And have a great afternoon and a great evening, Jean-Paul, and great to see you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.